Alrighty guys, welcome back to your remote learning experience. This lesson is going to be for Wednesday, April 22nd. Sometimes I have to really think about the date because I usually record these the day before I send them out to you. Okay? Hope you guys had a great flex day yesterday and you were able to get some good work done. And if you got all that work done, hopefully you were able to get outside a little bit, do something fun. Yesterday was pretty nice out and today's pretty nice out too. Today as in Tuesday. I don't know about tomorrow though. But today's lesson, we are going to be diving right into genetics, which is one of my favorite units. I think it's so much fun to really learn about inheritance and how things are passed on from parents to offspring. So yeah, that is going to be so much fun. I'm kind of bummed that we didn't get to do this in class together because there's so many different fun activities to do, but I think we're still going to have a good time even if we're doing this remotely, okay? So for this lesson, I wanted to go over some of the vocabulary terms that you guys were working with on Monday because I think right now these are kind of just meaningless words, and I hope to kind of shed some light on the meaning to some of these and how we're going to be using them. Okay? So let's get right into it, starting off with genetics. All right, so genetics is pretty much just the study of inheritance, how things are passed on from parents to offspring. And this isn't just specific to humans. There was actually this guy, Gregor Mendel, who you can read about in your book if you want, who studied pea plants in a monastery. And so he actually contributed a lot to modern day genetics, which is pretty cool. And we're going to be talking about some of the things that he discovered and also some of the concepts that are relevant to us in genetics, all right? So first, we're going to kind of circle back to when we were talking about chromosomes and genes, okay? So this is my fancy whiteboard. Okay, hopefully I'm still recording here. Yes, I am. Okay, so get out of here. How do I move this? Hey, there we go. All right. So if you guys remember, all of your genetic information is stored in this lovely molecule called DNA. Okay? And that DNA can be organized into chromosomes. Okay? So remember, you have 46 chromosomes total. You have 23 copies of each chromosome. 2 copies of each chromosome. So 23 pairs of each chromosome. So let's say this is chromosome number 1. All right, I have 2 copies of chromosome number 1. One of these came from my mom, and one of these came from my dad. Okay? So, if you guys remember, chromosomes and DNA have sections on them called genes. So I'm going to color this gene red. Okay? So, this is a gene, which is just a section of a chromosome. Okay? And so that section of the chromosome will code for a specific trait. So sometimes genes are able to code and give instructions for making different enzymes or other different kinds of proteins. But in this case, I wanted us to talk a little bit more about just traits, okay? So for example, this could be a gene on here that gives instructions for determining eye color or hair color when you're born, okay? So that is one way that genes can be kind of relevant here, all right? But I want to zoom in to this gene down here and talk about a new term that we just learned on the vocab sheet. All right, and this I'm going to draw it again. This is our gene. Okay, so this is just a zoomed in version of what I just had. Okay, this is called, or what I want to talk about is a term called an allele. An allele is just a different version of a gene. Okay, so the best example that I can think of that's not science related is when I think of peanut butter. And peanut butter is one of my favorite foods, so I'm just gonna talk about peanut butter for a sec. So if we think of our gene as peanut butter, all right, the alleles are different versions of peanut butter. Okay, so there's smooth peanut butter, there's chunky peanut butter. Those are the two basic kinds I can think of, but I'm sure there's more crazy types of peanut butter. Okay, so alleles are just more specific versions of a gene. Okay, so a gene is more broad and the allele is more specific. So in terms of a science example, let's say I have a gene that codes for eye color and determines what color eyes I'm going to have, all right? The alleles would be the specific types of eye color, like blue eyes, brown eyes, or green eyes, for example. Okay, the gene is eye color, it's more broad, and the alleles are more specific, being blue eyes, brown eyes, or green eyes. Okay, so that's how you can kind of think of an allele. It's just a different version of a gene. Okay, and how these alleles are paired together on your genes determines what traits you are going to have. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into that. I'm going to be clearing all of this, so if you need to pause the video, you can absolutely do that right now to kind of take a screenshot of this or add any of this to your vocab sheet if you really want to, okay? But I'm going to clear the whole thing. Okay, so now I want to get into what we call dominant and recessive alleles. Okay, so dominant and recessive are both on your vocabulary sheet. Okay, so I'm going to draw those chromosomes that I had once again. So let's say this is the chromosome that I have from dad, and this is the chromosome that I have from mom. Sorry, these drawings are not the best. Okay, so I'm going to draw my gene once again right here. Okay, except I'm not going to fill it in this time. Okay, so these chromosomes are what we call homologous, if you guys remember that. So homologous chromosomes have similar structure. And in most cases, what that means is that they have the same genes on the same locations. Okay? So all that means is that, for example, on this chromosome, on these two chromosomes, the gene for eye color can be found right here and right here. They are on the same exact spot on the chromosome. Okay, that's not super important to remember, but it is something that we have gone over before. Okay, and so let's say we have our gene. Let's say that gene is for hair length, or no, hair type. Okay, so if the gene is hair type, my alleles, let's say curly and straight. Okay, curly hair, straight hair. Okay, so the way that scientists actually like to represent alleles is just through letters. Okay, so instead of writing curly or straight, scientists might represent these with letters. Okay, so I'm going to write a capital H right here and a lowercase h right here. Okay, so this might be a little confusing. Why are you using the letter H, Miss DeShane? What about all the other letters? I'm just abbreviating H for hair for now. This is just an example. I have no idea if this is actually how hair inheritance works, but just bear with me here, okay? So when we have alleles, some alleles can be dominant, and some alleles can be recessive. Okay, dominant alleles are usually always represented by a capital letter. And then the recessive alleles are represented by a lowercase letter. So in this case, we have a capital H for straight hair. So I'm going to just say that straight hair is going to be a dominant allele, okay? And that curly hair is going to be a recessive allele because it has a lowercase letter and straight hair has an uppercase letter, okay? So all this means is that a dominant allele will take over a recessive allele when these are paired together, okay? And to represent that, I'm going to show this on the chromosomes, okay? So let's say the chromosome that you got from your mom, let's say your mom has an allele for curly hair. Okay, so I'm going to put an H right there, okay? And let's say that your dad has an allele for straight hair. Okay, and remember these alleles were passed down from your parents. This doesn't necessarily mean that your dad has straight hair and that your mom has curly hair, but these are some of the alleles that they passed on to you. Okay, so let's say that these are your genes right here, your alleles. Okay, the combination of these alleles right here is what determines the actual, what we call phenotype. Actually, never mind. These alleles combined together, the capital H and the lowercase h, are called genotype. Sorry for that confusion. Okay, so your genotype is made up of two different alleles. Or of two alleles, they don't have to be different. Okay, and so a genotype is pretty much important because it helps determine phenotype, which is a physical trait. Okay, so the phenotype is a physical representation of the genotype. Okay, so let's say our two alleles right here from this chromosome, I'm going to write off to the side right here, are a capital H and a lowercase h together. Okay, remember this capital H is dominant and this lowercase h is recessive. So this being a dominant trait, this uppercase H, means that it will take over the recessive allele, and the phenotype or the physical trait that is expressed in this individual will be the trait that is represented by the dominant allele. So in this case, an individual that would have a capital H and a lowercase h together would have straight hair. Okay, because this allele, this dominant allele, takes over the recessive allele, doesn't let it really do anything, and so eventually this individual is going to have straight hair instead of curly hair. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. I know this can be a little bit confusing, but I'm trying to go through it as slow as I can. Okay, So you might be wondering, well, Mr. Shane, what about if, like, does that mean curly hair can never happen? Which is not true. Okay, I'm going to erase this really quick. Okay, we can also have a situation where the alleles are the same. So instead of having a capital H and a lowercase h, let's say I have two lowercase h's. So both mom and dad had an allele for curly hair that was passed down to the offspring. Okay? So these alleles together would make up the genotype, and that genotype determines the phenotype. Okay? So the genotype here would be a lowercase h and a lowercase h. Okay? And this is a case where I would have curly hair. Okay? The only time that you could have a recessive allele be actually expressed in the phenotype or physical trait is if you have two of them together. Okay? Because the dominant trait isn't coming in and taking over the recessive trait. Okay? We have two recessive alleles right here that combined to express the recessive trait, which happens to be curly hair. Okay? Hopefully this makes sense. If this doesn't make any sense, I'm actually going to attach an Amoeba Sisters video and other resources that you can use. Or you can email me and say, Mrs. Shane, I don't know what you're talking about. You're just blabbering for 30 minutes. I will not be offended. Okay? And we can also have a situation where we have two uppercase H's too. Like this. In that case, the genotype would be capital H, capital H. There's two dominant alleles, so that individual would still have straight hair. Okay? So anytime there is a dominant allele in our genotype, the dominant trait is going to be expressed, which is, in this case, straight hair over curly hair. Okay? So I hope this makes a little bit of sense. I'm actually going to erase all of this right now, so if you need to pause the video to just kind of take any notes or kind of just let it sink in, please do that, but I'm going to clear this right now. Clear all drawings. Okay, so I think the last two terms that I want to go over for today are, let's see, on our vocab sheet. So we did genetics, allele, dominant, recessive, genotype, phenotype. I want to go over homozygous and heterozygous, and then that'll be it for this lesson. Okay? So these are the last two terms that I am going to go over today. Okay? And this is homozygous and heterozygous. Okay, so if we go back to our curly hair and straight hair example, remember we had our dominant allele, which was a capital H, and this happened to be straight hair. And then we had our recessive allele, which was a lowercase h, and this was curly hair. Okay, I kind of just want to show a brief chart that will kind of explain the terms heterozygous and homozygous a little bit better. Okay, and remember that these can have different combinations to make up your genotype, which will eventually determine your phenotype. Okay, so the three examples that we went over, first to start, we had a capital H and a lowercase h. Okay, so that was our genotype. All right, a little chart here. And our phenotype, or the physical expression of that genotype, was straight hair. Okay, so now, depending on the combination of alleles that you can actually have genes or alleles, or I guess traits that are homozygous or what we call heterozygous. Okay, so heterozygous traits have different combinations of alleles. Okay, I want to make sure I'm using the correct terms from your book. Okay, so having two different alleles, okay, for example, this individual has an allele for straight hair and an allele for curly hair. This would be a hetero, which means different, zygous trait or individual. Okay, so having two different alleles in your genotype. Okay, so let's go over the second example that we did, which was a lowercase h and a lowercase h, which we found out was the genotype, and the phenotype was curly hair. Because we had two recessive alleles, and without the dominant allele taking over the recessive allele, the recessive trait, which was curly hair, could actually be expressed. Okay? So in this case, we don't have two different alleles, we have two of the same alleles, both for curly hair. This would be a homozygous trait. Remember, homo means same. Okay? The last example that we went over was a oh crap, I didn't mean to do that. Was a situation where we had two capital H's. Okay? So, in this case, the individual had two dominant alleles, which would express straight hair, okay, which was the dominant trait here. All right? This trait would also be homozygous because we have two of the same allele. We have two capital H's, okay? So homozygous would be two capital H's. Homozygous would also be two lowercase h's. And a situation where we have a heterozygous trait is when we have a capital H and a lowercase h, which is one of each, okay? So this was one just example of a trait that could be passed on from generation to generation. Like I said earlier, I'm not exactly sure that this is how hair inheritance works. I'm pretty sure it's not. It's probably a lot more complicated than that, but just an example that I wanted to go over with you guys, okay? So we are going to be doing a little bit of practice with genotype and phenotype, and that is actually going to lead us into what we call Punnett squares. So I'm sure you guys have heard of Punnett squares before, and that actually helps us determine the likelihood of certain traits being passed down from parents to offspring depending on what the genotypes of the parents are. Okay, so I'm actually really excited to get into Punnett squares because I think there's a lot of really cool and fun things that we can do. Okay, so that's going to be it for the lesson today. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Remember to keep an eye out on PowerSchool if you have missing assignments. Please get those into me as soon as possible, okay? Have a great Wednesday and looking forward to being with you guys soon.